What if I told you everything that's wrong with the world today can be pretty easily traced back to key figures and key events? What if there was a pretty simple answer for how did America become the bad place? In fact, since episode 1 of Overthinking Everything, I've been deconstructing the culture of cultism that led to all this. But for every cult, there is a leader. Many cults, if they last long enough, will branch out, if you will, franchise. And the thing about cults is they sort of intertwine with everything around them, infiltrating areas we think are safe, but then sneaking their little messages and agendas in subconsciously and subversively. Like cancer. For the last 13 episodes, I've been discussing specifically how we fell victim to this cult of desensitization and dehumanization. Taking what we've covered so far over the next 2 episodes, I'm laying out a claim that one man's thirst for power wrote the blueprint and playbook for 4 key figures to dominate the last 4 decades, and it laid the groundwork for the 4 key figures who will determine the future of this planet. When capitalism failed multiple times, how did America manage to satiate a starving working class and distract us from our dwindling American dream and the American nightmare that would come? No, sadly, this isn't about Daddy Dusty and his rising son, Cody Rhodes, but maybe it kinda is. I'm deconstructing the greed that breeds division and destruction. We'll learn about the major tech movements and key governmental actions or inactions that allowed these very white and wealthy men to infiltrate our brains, indoctrinate us into cultism, and groom us all into believing we had a shot at winning that solid gold, diamond, encrusted red, white, and blue United States. No. World champ. No. Universal Heavyweight Championship. Because America's obese. It wasn't until we grew up that we realized it was all scripted. The winners and losers were decided before our entrance music even played. By the time we stepped into the ring, everything we were doing was for entertainment purposes only. Who's to blame? You know their names, but I bet you've never thought of them together this way. Who and what really contributed to the dumbing down and numbing down of America? I have the answers. You're probably not going to like it. Welcome to the podcast. Game shows had always given the middle class America regular Joe and Jane the opportunity to try their luck at cash and prizes. It afforded the audience at home the opportunity to see real people doing great things, even if those great things were plinko, spinning a wheel, trivia, strategy, or showcasing a specific unique talent. You think about the nostalgia of classic game shows. I loved Card Sharks, Password, Supermarket Sweep, Press Your Luck, The Price is Right, and Match Game. Hell, if I'm being honest, I loved most of the classic game shows. It was a guaranteed feel-good vibe most of the time, colorful, with catchy music, smiles, jokes, and anecdotes. Rarely did you leave an episode on a low note. After all, who would come back tomorrow? We would root for our players, pick our favorites, often without considering why. Win or lose, join us next time for more Waste Your Life Away watching other people living theirs. Regardless, by the 1970s, networks realized that game shows were easy money. Usually low budget to produce, easy to crank out several shows in a day's tapings, trade out for prizes in exchange for advertising mentions or product placement considerations. Actually, by the time the 70s and 80s rolled around, many of these shows were produced by entities that were tied to corporations. Well, hell, they always were, really, but it's like, you may not know that Shampoo X is produced by Corporation Y because it's a separate brand name, and Corporation Y's logo is really small on the back. We poop watching our phones now. Nobody's read the back of a shampoo bottle since 2004. Game shows with affiliations or ties to those companies might have an easier time offering prizes, is what I'm saying. These shows weren't expensive to produce, even if they gave away a new car. Watch the end credits. That little text graphic with the Los Angeles car dealership and manufacturer of the vehicle playing for 1.5 seconds at the end of most watched game shows in America, that's certainly worth the little money that car cost the dealership. That was advertising gold, baby. America didn't care where the prizes came from or how the prize was procured. America was awash in commercialism and materialism and just wanted to win a new toaster oven or 15 seconds of fame. Meanwhile, one of the major reasons many of our enemies hate us is our blind devotion to the cult of capitalism. But that's advanced level political science and economics stuff right there. This one is about what led to this. Much of that I discussed leading up to now. There was a shift in our media, part of which is the natural evolution of things. Nothing stays the same forever. Still, as America struggled through the 70s following the Vietnam War, Nixon, and the political chess meddling of Ronald Reagan shoving his hand up Gerald Ford's ass and using him as a muppet, the stage was deliberately set for economic disaster as Jimmy Carter took office because the Republicans really did set up the shitty economy of the late 70s so Reagan would have something to run on. Similar to what happened during COVID in the modern era and leading into the Biden presidency. Pause on the economics for a moment. We will circle back around to it later this season, don't worry. Technology had developed significantly during the 70s, with computer technology rapidly evolving from taking up a whole room to the birth of arcade console video games. By the 80s, America was growing addicted to technology and home console games. By the 90s, that would grow into a dependency on tech and handheld games. Today, any and everything we want to be addicted to or dependent on is right in our pockets. Any game you want to play, you can today. Games from every direction. Games. Oh, the games people play. But sports was different a half century ago as well. While still rivalrous and contentious as fans, there was still the mutually respected rules of the game, culturally speaking. If the ref didn't see it, we had to accept it and move on. Better luck next time. Nobody's perfect. Well, Kurt Hennig was. We'll get to that too. America was hooked on board games as early as the turn of the century. Monopoly caught on like wildfire, as it would in today's economically oppressive times. Just like then, Monopoly lampooned America's exploitive, debaucherous capitalism and showcased just how unjust it was. Monopoly was essentially about taking the most you could from everyone and forcing others into bankruptcy, crushing your competitors. Who didn't play Monopoly? Who didn't learn? Well, a lot of things I covered earlier this season. Board games, then live sports, then video games. As I stated at the end of the Great Social Media Experiment series, today's social media kind of is the modern-day interactive video game. It's interactive Pinterest meets Pac-Man, waka waka waka, gobbling up the likes and reactions, while pigeonhole niched to draw specific followers. Just like reality TV, social media offers an unlimited number of communities. For the old game show fans, you can watch people playing video games. I don't know why you would, but you can. If you want to just watch people living their lives publicly, try TikTok Live. Instagram, Facebook, any of the giants offer these communities, just like we find in the real world, if we look hard enough. Online, it's just a search bar, instead of a thumbtacked flyer on a corkboard at the community center of yesteryear. Social media makes it easier, period. The anonymity and separation of social media is what makes it possible for so many to jump on and do it. And many wouldn't even log into the app if you couldn't use some quirky screen name. If we had to use our names, faces, and identify ourselves legally, I wonder who'd wade in those waters. But many of these groups exist just as a loose collective of individuals waiting to unite and be a community. The internet and social media was basically a giant career fair for interests and communities. Sample the different booths, decide who you like, sort of like we did with game show contestants and later reality show contestants. We pick our favorites, pick a side, and pledge that allegiance publicly. Even if there isn't a prize at the end, the Kardashians are contestants. They're playing for prizes, wealth, product sales, influence, prestige, relevance. Reality television. TikTok specifically, but all live-streamed social media, is just free reality TV. Free reality TV made into a video game. You tap, 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 tap the screen and add those likes and hearts. Look at all those comments. It's been shared how many times? Waka, 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 waka. But reality TV isn't all it's cracked up to be. On the surface, it's real-world entertainment. However, it's as scripted as professional wrestling, with the drama either performed or instigated behind the scenes, then filmed when the blow-up ensues. Just like our news devolving to editorialized, narrative-hosted shows with little factual sustenance and a bounty of bias thanks to the blurred lines of information and entertainment. That infotainment effect impacted entertainment television just as much as it did the news. For entertainment, the blurred lines between the show and the commercials was recognized as so psychologically dangerous in the 1960s and 70s, America realized that needed to be restricted or regulated somehow, at least addressed. So, after these messages, we'll be right back, was bred. Reality TV didn't just blur the lines of media. It didn't just incorporate marketing messages and product placement inappropriately into the show, into the background. It blurred the lines of reality. In fact, the idea that these shows are sold as reality TV when they are almost always scripted and or edited in a way that follows the producer's narrative rather than what really happened is corrupt messaging in and of itself. It's false advertisement, a bait and switch of the worst kind. Many of these shows don't effectively communicate that they are for entertainment purposes only, and that this part was taped 8 times before they got it right, and that part was a reshoot on another day because they ran out of memory card space and they didn't have time to get another memory card before the shoot day ended because, it's all unions, so they have to follow those rules. So they had to take everybody's photos, match the makeup, the hair, the outfits, and the placement of every little thing on the set before the next shoot day, which will be probably next week. Instead, viewers just watch reality TV as it's presented. No disclosures, no disclaimers, no concern for the mixed messaging. Any of those disclaimers are thrown away where no one really pays attention, like sales, political, or pharmaceutical ads. Reality TV exploited one of the most marginalized groups in America, the vapid and utterly talentless. They mined that demographic for their stars and audience. Sorry. Not sorry. Before reality television, these people had no hope of any kind of potential. Until reality competition shows, of course. Look, if anyone can dunk a basketball, then dunking a basketball just isn't as impressive as it used to be, right? I mean, even if somebody J.R. Riders that thing up and over their heads between their legs while doing a cartwheel, it's just a fancy dunk. Point guards dunk. The WNBA can dunk. Middle schoolers can dunk. Oh, wow, he jumped over a car. He's trying too hard. You know what? Just make a jump shot. Whatever happened to the jumper? Nail a tray. Now that's impressive, Steph. Reality TV made being on TV less special in that regard. If anybody can land 13 three-pointers in a game, then Curry's just a dish that gives me bad gas. Just like these messages you sit through until your show comes back on, they seem fun and delightful going in, but how that processes through your system isn't always fun or delightful. In fact, these messages and the ones that evolved into the shows as deregulation began in the 80s could become quite traumatic. We are the sum of all our parts. Sure, we've been talking about the 90s and even the 80s a lot with these last Baker's Dozen episodes. But this is really about deconstructing and reconstructing ourselves in some weird science experiment. Well, just like Anthony Michael Hall and that other guy designed the program that would create life from a dream board collage of magazine clippings, and whammo, out pops Kelly LeBrock. Well, we kind of do the same thing. Or we have that done to us. I can assure you, Kelly LeBrock is not the end result of this weird science experiment. In a moment, I'm going to deconstruct some of the key tech advancements that made this current socio-political atmosphere in America possible. I'll break down the key legislation that pushed it forward. Then, I'm circling back around to some of those key figures I hinted at in the beginning of this episode. Then, in part 2, I'll tie this all together with a big red Reagan bow, and I'll discuss the key figures who will dictate our futures. But first, we need to have a talk about consent. I want to talk with you about consensual messaging and influence versus non-consensual messaging and influence. This is going to be hard because I'm touching on sensitive nostalgia and familial or cultural loyalties that take years to overcome. It's hard enough to admit we have a problem, much less acknowledging just how bad the problem is. Much less reckoning that once we do acknowledge that, we can't unacknowledge that. Try to approach what I'm about to say with an open mind. Remember the buffet analogy I used in previous episodes? Where the buffet is all of media and we walk up to load our plate with whatever appeals to us. How balanced is that plate? How disciplined are we? Now, consider why you go for the things you go for. Keeping with that buffet analogy, why do you pick fried chicken, pot roast, soup, dessert, whatever? Sure, you like fried chicken, but why? Who introduced you to fried chicken? In my culture, fried chicken is a staple. In fact, I love fried chicken. But it's because I was told and taught to love fried chicken. From as early as I can remember, I have the smell of cast iron boiling oil and flour everywhere. My mouth is watering right now. I could write a dissertation on fried chicken. Yes, it's appealing to my senses, but where would I be if deep fat frying wasn't a cultural norm? We come to love new foods all the time if we have the courage to try them, if we're open to it. Often if it's similar to something else we like. Too often we dismiss foods we don't like because we've never revisited that we don't like them or why we don't like them and didn't like them in the first place. We just don't like it, and that's that forever and ever. Amen. We are the sum of all our parts. If we're into hunting, there's a pretty solid chance that's a familial handed-down trait. If someone's into something, there's likely a reason, and maybe a reason someone isn't. But it usually goes way deeper than we realize. Some do a little digging, but stop when they find the answer they're looking for without wondering what they weren't looking for. Let's go with racing because my hunting story is dark as fuck and not fit for public consumption. Who or what introduced me to racing? As a kid, I didn't have anyone pushing me toward racing. It was a Southern culture thing, but I never really considered myself Southern. So mine isn't a who, but a what. And the same what turned me away from it. If I don't have a who tied to this thing, which is most often the case with occultism, what is it about racing that turned me on as a kid? If once you answer that, you dig a little deeper, you find out what led you to appeal to that. Then you can just keep going. Well, maybe you watched Smokey and the Bandit as a kid. Cannonball Run, Dukes of Hazzard. Fastest car gets the girl, right? It wins the race. Vroom, vroom. Watching my dad outrun and outsmart the cops. I certainly played with cars and had car toys as a kid. I just wasn't into mechanics and getting dirty. That's what disrupted my autophile cultism. That and Bobby Brady. I loved classic television. Those families became my surrogate families I turned to for comfort when my own family fell apart. It's sad, but true. Who didn't grow up on the Brady Bunch? When they did reunion movies, I was all in. I loved catching up with my favorite families. Where are they now? For Bobby, it was a wheelchair. He became a race car driver, had a wreck, got paralyzed. Kind of dark, don't you think? Where's that laugh track now? But it hit me that there were consequences for the vroom vroom. I just wasn't that into cars, so I turned to something else. Imagine if I never saw that Bobby Brady episode and that Brady Bunch reunion. God, vroom indeed. Holidays, Christmas was important to me. Where's that laugh track now? But it hit me that there were consequences for the vroom vroom. I just wasn't that into cars, so I turned to something else. Now imagine if I never saw that Brady Bunch reunion. Vroom indeed. Holidays. Christmas was important to me, kind of, but it was more important to everyone but me. I tried really hard for a long time for the kids, but none of those traditions mattered, and the reason for the season has been so commercialized and bastardized, it means nothing but a shopping spree and paying December's bills in January. Or February. When the people around me who cared about Christmas died, left, grew up, or whatever, I just don't see the need for trees, tinsel, and fa-la-las. That's really simplifying deconstructing, but what I'm covering in the rest of this episode deals with a level of cultism we all fall victim to without the full understanding of the costs, the consequences, and most importantly, that it isn't all our fault. Personal responsibility only goes so far. We were made to be like this. I'm about to discuss exactly how. Again, we were given the keys to the Hellcat Challenger, the liquor cabinet, and the parental controls to the remote at like 12 years old. What did we think was going to happen? With technology booming in the late 20th century, along with America's desire to monetize any and everything they could, we leapt from broadcast airwaves to cable and satellite, then internet, and then streaming and social media. Key eras, if you will, of communication for modern Americans. This is the evolution of how we talk with one another. The truth of Reconstruction following America's Civil War will be covered later this season in the finale, White Noise. However, what we need to know is that America was burning the candle at both ends, economically, physically, socially. Lincoln and the 19th century liberals freed the slaves. Many will scoff at that because they don't understand politics, just words they regurgitate. But those slaves were freed, and most Americans didn't want them here, much less know what to do with them if they were here. If they aren't working for free, most Americans didn't want to pay them, right? We need to understand that even many of the abolitionists were against slavery because of the inhumanity of it, or whatever, but they weren't for intermingling. Many of them were racists. That was the cultural norm. Hell, that was the cultural moray. The American South was stuck with an infestation they brought over under false pretenses. That's how they saw it. As in, from a certain defeated perspective, America brought in livestock, and then when the livestock made the South a lot of money, the North dictated that the livestock were no longer livestock, but instead were people and couldn't be kept and bred like cattle anymore. This culture spent so much time dehumanizing these people, these human beings that they kept on chains, that when confronted with the reality that they were behaving like animals, looking at these human beings as animals, they revolted, literally and figuratively. It didn't sit well with the Confederates. The South has always been looked down upon. Big chip on our shoulder down here. Anger issues and no management. That's just the slaves. We've still got all the other immigrants to cover, and we kind of skipped over the atrocities committed against the indigenous peoples of this land. Again, this is a big part of the series finale of Overthinking Everything. Let's just sum it up with everybody got treated like shit by America. Except the wealthy white men. Some things never change. Suffice to say, America has carried that around with us since then, plus with all that debt we racked up post-Reconstruction, rebuilding our nation back after the Civil War over states' rights to own slaves, then Woodrow Wilson started the Federal Reserve. I covered a lot of this early part of the season, but while the Fed initially was the Hail Mary to save America from its own collapse in capitalism, it shifted the economic power away from the people in America and into the hands of the ultra-rich elite class. Names we've never heard of and names we would hear throughout the 20th century and beyond. The Federal Reserve was technically the third central bank of America, whose main role was to regulate the kind of fluctuations that result in banking scares, panics, crashes, recessions, or depressions, like the ones in 1873, 1893, then 1907. The years that followed the latter saw America's power brokers of business and government aligning for their best interests. This will come up later, but this is kind of how it went down. In 1907, we don't crash, but we do swerve really hard, wheel the ditch, fuck up our alignment really bad. In 1908, Congress enacted the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, written by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island and the co-sponsor, Representative Edward Vreeland of New York, both conservative Republicans. This act did a few things that aren't all that important right now, but one thing it did was establish the National Monetary Commission to study banking trends and advise Congress on currency reform measures. The chair and vice chair of that commission? Why, Senator Aldrich and Representative Vreeland, that's who. Who else would sit at the head of the table of his own bill, right? Bear in mind, 0 Democrats voted for this bill. None. 13 House Republicans wouldn't even support it, and another 5 Republican senators sided with the 17 Democrat senators and 140 representatives, saying this was not a great idea. So the commission comes back with recommendations. Congress shits on them. Back to the drawing board. Back again. Congress says no, 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 no. So then at a secret meeting at a hotel on Jekyll Island off the coast of southeast Georgia, Senator Aldrich met with some of the country's leading business and financial minds to, behind closed doors, revise those recommendations. Thus the birth of the Federal Reserve Act, which changed the way America handles money forever. This was intended to be a temporary fix to a growing issue. Well, it wasn't sold as a permanent thing anyway. It probably was intended to be. In 1914, the act was extended thanks to Britain and other countries calling in debt to be paid in gold. Gold we didn't have. Yeah, we literally wrote $1 million check America's $5 ass couldn't cash. From there, it became the new normal. Debt, debt, debt. Now, I'm not a fan of Woodrow Wilson, but he was working with the man who literally wrote the book on right to privacy, Louis Brandeis, who changed parties from Republican to Democrat in 1912. Brandeis was a progressive Republican around the late 1800s to the turn of the century, who's credited with many achievements against monopolies and corporate overreach. In fact, the leaning away from the Republicans is right on timeline with many in America seeing the corporate corruption and collusion in the conservative Republicans of that era. Progressive and liberal Republicans jumped ship to Democrat. I know, you're blown away by the terms, but things weren't what they are now. They were made to be this way because some of this. Conservative Aldrich was fighting hard for his big business benefiting reforms, while men like William Jennings Bryan and Senator from Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, fought along with Brandeis for a more progressive approach that would benefit the people more, the working class. Brandeis had gone up against J.P. Morgan in court, exposed insurance fraud in the early 20th century, fighting for workers' rights and benefits. In 1910, he said, "We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." Even Woodrow Wilson said America's banking system must be public, not private, and must be vested in the government itself so that the banks must be the instruments of business, not the masters. Still, we handed it all over to J.P. Morgan and a handful of other elites. The Fed itself, not outwardly a private entity. But what the act did was hand over the power of the financial markets over to the top players in the financial sector with no representation of middle America except a conservative majority in Congress. The debate is for another episode. The fact is that it shifted power to corporate America and out of the hands of we the people, as this nation was intended upon founding. From there, we've most recently discussed the deregulation of media over the last 40 years, and the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was the nail in the coffin for the How We Communicate with Each Other segment. This handed the power of our country's media to corporate interests and out of the hands of the public as it was intended. One more governmental act really shifted the course of America's social history, and that's Citizens United. The dark money in politics is a cancer we must cut out and nuke so we make sure we got it all. Citizens United traces its roots right back to that early financial legislation of the 20th century. Dark money ensures that the wealthy and corrupt will always get their way, while we, the working class, are left scrambling for the scraps, the crumbs, as it was intended. FDR even commented a similar sentiment when he pushed forth New Deal legislation that many conservatives opposed after driving America to poverty. It's been said that Roosevelt basically told the power players behind closed doors, look, if you don't give these people at least some crumbs, we won't have a country at all. And those power players listened. Since then, that's all they've given us. Fucking crumbs. Guess the era. Tensions in the Middle East. Oh shit, that's way too vague. Inflation threatening families. Oh. America exposed to reality television. No, this isn't the 80s or the 90s yet. This is the 70s. America was subjected to graphic coverage of the war in Vietnam and then the harsh realities of the economic ramifications to follow. The gas crisis and inflation were on everyone's minds. The trauma of that news coverage for most Americans is incalculable. We may never truly appreciate the constant inundation of stress on the average American. Maybe the closest we could come is waking up to embarrassing tweets for 4 years. We don't often think about the psychological damage that's done by what we take in media-wise, especially when it's presented as fact. It's almost like the brain shifts gears from inputting make-believe data into importing facts. How does the brain know the difference unless it's specifically stated? After these messages, we'll be right back. News coverage alone, the stress of the constant worry over finances, surely didn't leave Americans feeling very secure. We all know how traumatic financial insecurities can be. Ronald Reagan made a play for the presidency before he won in 1980. 4 years prior, he primaried Gerald Ford, the sitting incumbent and unelected successor to Nixon. I'll cover more of Reagan's actual rise to power in the next episode because it will take that long. It's that playbook that was the framework of success for 4 key figures who transformed American society forever. The internet, social media. That technology is one of the greatest advancements in human history, and one of the most detrimental. It's like many others throughout history. It's all in how you use it, whose hands it's in. The expanse of the world's information available in our front pockets in a 3 by 6 inch thin, well, who knows what it's even made of, right? Magic. Even in the late 20th century, the brightest science fiction minds were still dreaming up these boxy, inconvenient means of telecommunicating. From the days of boxing up magnetic tape reels and shipping them from point A to point B, to emailing, airdropping, or cloud sharing files instantly. None of any of that would be possible without the advancements in the technology of the personal computer. Steve Jobs isn't the only name in tech during the 70s through the 2000s. but he certainly is one of the most influential. His backstory has been told 1,000 times already, so let's just cover the basics with the disclaimer that I don't equate these men as equals ideologically, morally, or otherwise. Nor do I suggest all of them are or were sinister. In fact, maybe that old Sesame Street song, "One of these things is not like the other," should apply. Steve Jobs was a trailblazer of personal computing and technology, period. Everything that led Apple to what Apple is today is impressive enough, but Macintosh on, Jobs' legacy was cemented. But Jobs was forced out of Apple in 1985. I told you it was an important year. 12 years later, he'd return after Apple bought the company Jobs formed after leaving Apple. Apple was on the verge of going under, and Steve Jobs saved the day and turned Apple into what it is today. In 1997, Windows was making personal computing really easy and was growing because Apple bounced Steve Jobs in '85 and allowed Windows to succeed. Full disclosure, I'm not an Apple guy. I have an iPhone, but not really my choice. It was just here and had a decent camera. I'm a Windows and Droid fella. My own bias checked, though. Everything is what it is today because of Steve Jobs. That's the significance of the timeline. The rest is just a bunch of benchmarks of innovation from the Apple Macintosh, Laser Writer, Lucasfilm, Pixar. Steve Jobs touched it all and continues to posthumously. The technology he spawned and what spawned from his ideas and the competition laid the groundwork for today. I'm not an iFan, but my prejudice here doesn't negate that Apple globally is an influential product that has enabled and progressed humankind. From personal computing, internet technology, gaming technology, and the movies and shows we love today. Thanks, Steve Jobs. Not a very political person, but those who were political people, who may not have had the best interests of Americans in mind, had more ways to exploit consumers than ever before, thanks to Steve Jobs. That is not the legacy of Steve Jobs, and I hope that it never is. But this isn't really about Steve Jobs. This is about other men. Very different men. Picture it. Adelaide, the capital of South Australia, 1952. The owner of the News, a small local newspaper, passes away. His son takes over the news. In storytelling, that's called foreshadowing. Over the course of the years following the takeover, the son then sets his eyes on the other side of the globe to conquer the land of conquerors. Apparently, the news just wasn't enough. He wanted control of the news of the world. And in 1969, Rupert Murdoch took on the UK and he got it. Then he took control of the Sun. These are all publications. Don't take them literally. Then 6 years later, in 1974, with journalism colonies down under and in the UK, Murdoch set up a colony in New York City. While managing his international interests, Murdoch was working to establish himself into America's exponentially expanding broadcast media. Thar was gold in them thar hills, yuns. In 1981, Murdoch buys his first major British actual newspaper that wasn't just some sort of tabloid publication or local paper. The Times was legit news. His empire of information was growing globally. Still, his foothold into American media was slow growth of influence, waiting for the right time to attack, while, of course, finagling his way to the top. 1985. We've talked about it before. This was the year Rupert Murdoch decided to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. He was so patriotic, he surrendered his Australian citizenship. Yeah, don't fool yourself. America's FCC had rules against foreign entities owning U.S. TV networks. It's almost like we realized people who weren't Americans might not have America's best interest in mind. Oh, those darn loopholes. Look, this is all basic timeline stuff. This is available anywhere you search the origins of any of these men. I'm just plugging the pieces of this puzzle into place. By 1986, his company, News Corporation, based out of Manhattan, pursued a deal to purchase 20th Century Fox, hyphenated. And consider that for a moment. Just consider the timeline, please. 85, he's suddenly an American. He immediately closes the deal on 20th Century Fox hyphenated, then makes it 20th Century Fox unhyphenated. The film studio that brought us Planet of the Apes, The Omen, Star Wars, Revenge of the Nerds, and Porky's. Just saying, before Murdoch took over, the Star Wars series were their highest grossing films. Since then, a much different story. This, just like my discussion in the previous episode about the internet and social media, it isn't about condemning the bad thing. The bad thing just is because we let it be. In fact, the thing may be bad because we let it be bad. We must realize the error and the impact of these events because that's how history doesn't repeat. In fact, financially speaking, Murdoch really has the Midas touch. Not always a great thing, especially when money is the deity of the cult you're building. Murdoch was building more than a business and media empire. He was building a cult. It isn't to suggest that the film studio is as corrupt as Fox News Entertainment. It's merely scripting a timeline of events, the evolution of this empire. The man's worth over $21 billion. It's all relevant. Also relevant in that whole deal is Mark Rich. Rabbit hole that one on your own, but Rich was part owner in 20th Century Fox hyphenated. He also made trade deals with Iran amidst hostage crises. Mark Rich was as corrupt as they come and was charged with a slew of federal charges. The other co-owner of the hyphenated studio was Marvin Davis, who made his fortune in oil. You see where any of this is going? Well, Rich got caught, Murdoch saw the writing on the wall, and it was in gold ink. Murdoch flipped citizenship and bought in. Now, part of that deal was Davis and Murdoch going in together to buy some other TV stations, which Davis backed out on. Murdoch said screw it, did the deal himself, bought Davis out of the movie studio while he was at it, and then had 6 television stations all to himself, which would be the beginnings of the Fox Network, Fox Broadcasting Company, or just Fox. The Simpsons, In Living Color, Married with Children, Arsenio Hall, Cops. With deregulation, the craze in the 80s and 90s, it seemed like America's media was clearing the way for Rupert Murdoch. All the pieces fell into place almost as if it was orchestrated. However, in the year before the founding of Fox News Entertainment Channel and the Telecommunications Act, the heat was on Murdoch. His holdings were growing, his influence was spreading, and many were alarmed. By 1995, Rupert Murdoch was under the FCC's thumb because international allegations about his Australian base of operations being against the laws of media ownership in America, meaning it was illegal for Murdoch to own Fox Network while having Australian holdings, citizen or not. And a little simplified, but still illegal. So we basically had Murdoch on the ropes in 95, and the Federal Communications Commission ruled that his ownership of that network was in the best interests of the public. This was 1995. Now, while many business experts would tell you financially that might be true, did anyone consider the costs? We've talked a lot about the 90s, but here's where Murdoch gets into his stride of global propaganda and influence brokering. The decade begins with Roop starting up the company that would become Sky Group Limited today. Sky TV and British Satellite Broadcasting were both struggling to keep up financially with the expansion of cable television, and I'm sure the BBC didn't help. These station networks, they were about to go under, and Roop saw the potential for lucrative profits and influence. The merger of those two stations under the News Corp umbrella was the beginning. From a non-American perspective, Murdoch's influence dominated Premier League negotiations and secured a monopoly on the broadcast rights in the 90s and would last until it was broken up in the mid-2000s. We can't underestimate the cultural and social influence of sports entertainment media. There are messages delivered in the broadcast, some subliminal, and then the ads we're subjected to. It trains our brains in similar but very different ways that calm walks on the beach do. It's a much bigger argument. I'll get to it soon. As the decade of America's ethical erosion pushed on, Murdoch would expand into South America, Asia, and beyond. While the world worried about Y2K rendering us all helpless, Rupert Murdoch never even considered the notion his media outlets pushed so hard. The man had over 800 companies worldwide with headquarters in more than 50 countries. The FCC's endorsement in 1995 paved the way for Fox News Entertainment the following year. In fact, after that endorsement, Murdoch launched conservative publication The Weekly Standard. His film studio hit big with some of the biggest Hollywood blockbusters in history. His networks had some of the most cutting-edge shows in pop culture entertainment. In 2000, Rupert Murdoch was a multi-billionaire worth $5 billion. Murdoch was building an information empire. He wasted no time. Before the turn of the 90s, Murdoch would own HarperCollins Publishing House. 8 years after that, in 2007, Rupert Murdoch would buy the world's most notable financial publications, including the Wall Street Journal. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves, though. Listing what the man has owned would take quite a while. However, look at what was, is, and has been touched by Murdoch, and it's inarguable the significance of his influence in this dumbing down and numbing down of America. It's almost like there's this right hand, left hand effect. One has the Midas touch, the other drains the life out of whatever it touches. One hand turns everything to gold, one hand turns everything to rot. Rupert Murdoch. It's hard to equate our favorite films and TV shows to Fox News, or to assume Rupert Murdoch had any kind of ideological say in the entertainment aspect of things. This is to say that his influence of ideology has spread like a cancer and ignited some of the more conservative fires around this country and the world, but in some of those least capable to process those ideas and thoughts. Murdoch's reign of informational terror was built on lies, exploitation, and sensationalization. That's his influence, good or bad. If this were a whole episode about Rupert Murdoch, I'd talk about his influence in meddling in global business matters, his influence in meddling in political activities around the world. I might have a whole section devoted to the phone hacking scandal, the many, many scandals at Fox News. I might go deep diving into how Fox News Entertainment and Fox Network differ. I might explore how, in court testimony, people at Fox News have testified under oath that it's not news, just satirical commentary. I might explore his business dealings and discuss more why Rupert Murdoch did this and what he gained from that. But this isn't about Rupert Murdoch. This is about other men, too. From the art of the deal to you're fired, one man has stood tall in the realm of business and then brought business into the realm of reality entertainment broadcast television relevance. It's easy to discuss 2015 on. The influence of Donald Trump on American society from that point, that's a podcast of its own. There are probably a few, I'd say. Overthinking Everything will, of course, deal with some of that and already has. Let's talk about how in the world a man like that was able to even get that far. But here again, much of the man's timeline is well known, from the silver spoon to the bone spurs to the $1 million loan his daddy gave him. From the Nazi and Klan ties of his father to the Central Park Five, this slumlord millionaire's nickname, Teflon Don, stuck when nothing else seemed to. The scandals are too many to list before we get to the political stuff. The lawsuits, the allegations, what he said about women, his daughter, all of it. All before the election tampering, election denial, treason, and insurrection. Now, I would love to just go on and on and on about what the man did and got away with, how he bought his way out of every single lawsuit. That's exhausting, and honestly, giving the man any more attention is just, well, he committed treason. In the next episode, part 2, we'll really focus more on several of these figures, their rise, and how they relate to Reagan. Donald Trump is one of those. He isn't America's richest man. He isn't America's most successful man. He isn't America's best looking, best dressed, and certainly not America's smartest man. But what Donald Trump is a businessman. He's a negotiator, though many debate his prowess. He's wealthy, though many debate the size of, well, his debt, fortune, tax returns, hands, mushroom in a haystack, unquote. Many have argued that he's only successful because he puts the best people around him to do the work. He's just a daft figurehead. Well, we saw during his presidency with his cabinet appointments that only half of that was the case. So he must be something, right? A criminal? Well, we're back to that Teflon Don nickname. Labeling Donald Trump is easy. Defending that becomes laborious, especially to his cult. That cult was built on the foundation of Reagan, then fed and nurtured by the cult of Murdoch. But who and what careened that cult into this competition at any cost and closed-minded condemnation? From the tropes and stereotypes played up for entertainment purposes only, to the New World Order of ethical ambiguity of the 90s, upheld by the principle of kayfabe, the faces and the heels, and the what will they do to top this culture of professional wrestling seeped out of the ring and into every facet of American culture. It certainly impacted all of sports culture. I linked the turn of sports culture in the New World Order episode that really launched this segment of this season. From Rodman and Artest in the NBA, to Albert Hainsworth in the NFL, there are actually a lot of examples. Spygate, Deflategate, the Saints, the Patriots, just to name a few. Tyson bites the ear. Baseball players juice it up to hit home run records. Is it all wrestling's fault? It's certainly cultural influence in lowering our societal standards of sports and competition. Where else did sports decline in the ethics and integrity before Vince McMahon? I mean, he's the biggest heel in professional wrestling, right? Maybe the biggest heel in professional sports. Before we break kayfabe and assume the man's not just a Stanislavski nut, let's see if the argument holds that wrestling contributed more to this decline than other sports. In order to test this, we really must examine everything before 1982. That's when professional wrestling fell under the monopoly of Vince McMahon, when he bought what would become the WWF, then WWE from his father. Also Vince McMahon. No, little Vince didn't always own it all, and still doesn't. But just like Murdoch, Trump, and even Jobs, his dominating influence on his specific niche, the professional wrestling industry, is inarguable. Now, I'm not arguing that influence was just on the small world of wrestling, or even limited to sports entertainment. Just like Murdoch, Trump, and even Jobs, the domination exceeds and extends far beyond the niche, be it broadcast, business, tech, or sports entertainment. I'm arguing all the life of our culture has evolved to imitate the art of Vince McMahon more than Vince's art imitated life. That's a heel turn we weren't expecting. So let's set the flux capacitor for pre-1980s, right? I mean, hockey's always been violent, and I'd argue that in hockey culture, a good ass kicking on the street is as fair game as it is in a fair game. Football is violent. Football can be. Rugby is for different humans all together. Lacrosse, that's football with sticks. Contact sports as a whole, even with basketball's aggressive nature and baseballers pelting each other with 92-mile-per-hour curves or rushing the mound after, well, let's just state on one side, violently aggressive and competitive sports allow for a release of that energy, blowing off steam. The other side is, of course, that it feeds a psychological beast that otherwise may lay dormant. Regardless, the injuries and cultism of sports aside, the games in and of themselves aren't corrupt. It's not about the game, it's how you play it. Those who make the rules and set the standards for those games, that's another story for another podcast. So, major sports scandals, ethically speaking, of course. Pete Rose, legendary baseball player, banned by Major League Baseball for gambling on games his team played in. No, that ban came in 1989. He wasn't accused of betting as a player, only as a manager, which would have been 1986. I know, it just seems like forever ago. It isn't that there weren't scandals, it's just large-scale scandals were rare. And when there were scandals, well, media was print or broadcast outlets, major broadcast outlets. That old argument you hear, well, you just hear about stuff more these days. Well, that's alarming when the speaker doesn't understand what they mean is it was just as horrific then. We're just hearing about the horrific things now. Mid-'80s, that's not going to work. Many of the major ones that are easy to remember are all post-'80s. Dig a little deep. Please be kind. Rewind. There's the Black Sox scandal in the 1919 World Series. My Nana was born in 1919. She's been dead for a long time. So modern culture has had a lot of time to recover from that, right? We rewound too far. Fast forward a bit. The 40s and 50s saw a game-fixing scandal in New York college football just for the purpose of making bookies rich. Pause. While we're at it, the University of Kentucky's entire athletic program, not just the basketball players that accepted bribes in a point-shaving scandal, or the team, or the basketball program, the entire athletic department was banned for the 52 and 53 season. All to make some gamblers very rich and some very poor. The name of the gambling game. As a matter of fact, spoilers, and no actual horses were beaten for this or any other episode, capitalism is the cause of most of these scandals. Money infecting sports. For-profit games. On that note, fast forward just a little bit more, many believe that Sonny Liston's mafia debt and the money the mafia had on Muhammad Ali was behind the phantom punch that caused Liston to get knocked out in the first round back in 1965. A lot of ethical scandals around gambling, right? Why is it even allowed? How about we move away from money motives? Woody Hayes, the coach of Ohio State's football program, who punched a Clemson player in the throat for intercepting his quarterback's pass, then he decked one of his students when the kid tried to break up the fight. 1978. 2 years later, Rosie Ruiz won the Boston Marathon, and bear in mind, there weren't cameras and cell phones everywhere like there are today. This was 1980. Ruiz didn't just win, she cleared the competition. Then it was discovered and admitted that she took a huge shortcut. Who noticed? However, since the early 1980s, it's been one scandal after another. America's ethical integrity, especially in athletics, was really starting to waver. Why? I won't lay all the blame on one guy, but it sure does appear that kayfabe hitting the main event of Pop Culture Mania blurred the lines of reality. If this is the standard in this sport, then maybe we should push the boundaries in our own sport. If that's what the people want, give it to them. They'll pay more if it's more exciting. Seeing that trend pay off huge in sports, how many other industries pushed their own lines and boundaries? Sure, cable television, satellite, and the expansive worldwide broadcast media was on the horizon in the early 80s. But one man recognized the changing tides and set his sails on changing the course of American culture. Vincent Kennedy McMahon. The playbook on stereotyping, dehumanizing, trash-talking, beatdowns, revenge, rivalries, payback, pandering to a less-than-intellectual, frothing-at-the-mouth, bloodthirsty crowd, lying, cheating, stealing, and doing whatever it takes to win, even if it means turning on your closest friends and selling out to turn heel? Well, Vince didn't write it, but he sure followed it to a T, and then released his updated version. Coming up, part 2 of our Create Your Own Conspiracy Workshop. While many theorists whisper about Bilderberg, and they've sure had their influence, this one is about a bigger conspiracy to dictate the passiveness and temperament of society. I know that sounds big, but my argument of the dumbing down and numbing down of society in America boils down to one man, Ronald Reagan. Spoilers on that, but honestly, I'm surprised if you're not right along with me after all this time. In the next episode, I'm deconstructing the playbook that led to Reagan's rise, which honestly wasn't that much different than other notable populist figures in the 20th century. It was the cult of personality age, and Reagan was hanging 10, riding that wave all the way to the most powerful position on the planet. We'll see that the men I mentioned, aided by the legislation and the technological advancements in their respective arenas, paved the way for the decline of ethical integrity that spread like a cancer throughout our society. Americans swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. How did America go from mom, apple pie, God, and stars and stripes to yo mama, cream pies, the Undertaker, and back to the stars and bars? It happened right in front of our faces, and we cheered and jeered all the way to the bank. I'm discussing the real media bias next, and it isn't what you think, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my original music under my Sir Talks a Lot handle, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting and voiceover work. It's all organized in playlists for you. Check out my merch store and get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot Swags a Lot store. More products coming soon. Follow me on TikTok, everywhere online, joshbrandonmedia.com. Like, share, subscribe to this channel, do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. And if you like this series, maybe consider a donation to Cash App. This is my job. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.